core reasons that I started the Freethinker Institute is to teach people to have better critical thinking skills so they can think for themselves and analyze data from multiple sources, understand the bias of those sources, and take that into consideration when they look at those multiple sources, and then come to a real clear understanding of what truth is. Because I do think there are objective truths about reality that we can understand, and things are either right or wrong. Ultimately, we all need to make our own way in understanding what we think is right or wrong. And what I want to do is help empower people to be better capable of doing that. And so that's what a lot of our events have been focused on. They all kind of touch on it in one way, shape, or form, in my opinion. But that's very much part of what we're trying to do. And we do talk about political topics a little bit, and I did make a few political comments, but the idea is we want people from all political backgrounds to be welcome, because we all have misunderstandings no matter what political background we're from. I'm really an independent, just to put it out there, but regardless of where we're from, we all have misunderstandings about the world and life. And part of what I think is so valuable in life is to have people around us that we can trust to point out our misunderstandings and clarify like where we may have them. And part of our job is to think with an open mind, and we'll touch on this stuff tonight too, about like, hey, where could we be wrong about what we currently believe, and then come to a better understanding of the truth with time. So with that said, I do want to kind of kick things off. So I just want to welcome everybody to our Tuesday night meetup. I have 3 monitors, so I'm going to be pulling things up from different directions. And actually, I need to pull up the essay that I'm going to go over. And then basically, we're going to be discussing justice, fairness, and truth. Before we jump in, I want to give a quick introduction for people that are new to the group. The event tonight is brought to you by the Freethinker Institute, which is a not-for-profit looking to support and empower personal and professional development for members. Really, we focus on transformational development for anyone that's interested. We have free events on Tuesday evenings, and try to discuss ways to practically apply wisdom in our lives that benefit ourselves and those that we can influence. And then format-wise, I'm going to basically present the perspective on fairness and justice that I've thought through. And I'm going to ask a few questions along the way. And then together, after I've presented, we'll challenge those assumptions, anything that you guys feel like doesn't make sense or could be improved on. And we'll sort of evolve those ideas together communally to come up with an even better perspective as a group that hopefully will make sense and resonate with a lot of people, although different people are going to come to different conclusions. And that's part of the beauty of free thinking, is like everybody can use their own critical thinking skills to discern what they think is fact and fiction. But we want to listen to each other with an open mind. The only rule is that we need to be respectful, and we encourage people to limit comments to 4 minutes per time that they speak, just to give everybody a chance to talk. We will at some point pause to let people that haven't spoken be able to speak and jump to the head of the line. Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. I guess, there will be links to our website and contact information in the chat that Ellis will put out there. And then I guess by way of introduction, my name's Garrett. I'm your host for the evening. I'm also the executive director for the Freethinker Institute. And I'm basically a workaholic entrepreneur. My hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy, which kind of culminated into the Freethinker Institute, and that saying that if you want to see change in the world, be the change you want to see. And so my goal was to start an organization where people would think more for themselves and not follow blindly people who were steering them in the wrong direction. And essentially, the Freethinker Institute is what I do in my spare time to try to do good in the world, and for sort of intellectual nourishment, which probably for most of you that are coming here, you like me have a sense of needing to have sort of intelligent conversation with people, and that's what these events and our online community are for. And Ellis will post links to the online community, which is done through a software called Discord, which is a free text chat, which you can then jump into voice chat. And then you can have video chat and screen shares and stuff like that on there as well. And it's totally free. And there's a desktop app and a mobile app. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Like I said, if you have questions, just go ahead and raise your hand. And I will not be following the text chat because I'm a terrible multitasker. Most people are. And so definitely feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. And Ellis, if there's anything in the text chat that we should bring up, just raise your hand and I'll bring it up. So Richard, you have a question already. Go ahead. Or were you just practicing raising your hand? Richard.
Sorry, I didn't unmute. Is this group free thinking means that every cockamamie idea is equally valued?
No. So
objective truth.
So what it means
basis for our scientific and technical perfection is respect for objective truths, which can be mathematically proven.
So,
anything else, I mean, the guy who talked about autism and vaccinations was disbarred. His truth was based upon 9 sample, purely anecdotal.
Right. So Richard,
saying that the truth, that lies are halfway around the world before
yes, I
can tie up their shoes.
Let me just make clear, I was just stating what some of the beliefs are out there are. I was not stating my beliefs. I was just saying that we used to interpret things differently, and we made a point, or the people in charge at the time made it a point to mandate vaccines, and we eradicated certain diseases.
So I do want to
there are those beliefs.
I do want to just jump in. Like, we're not going to talk about vaccines tonight. We're going to talk about justice and fairness. And while there is a relation between those two, I'm a Myers-Briggs intuitive, and so I tie stuff together very quickly. And there is a relation, but I want to limit the conversation to fairness and justice. And so the questions during the presentation, based on feedback from prior attendees, should be limited to just what's being presented to get clarification and understanding, rather than to question or debate the things that I'm presenting. After I've presented, then definitely feel free to question and debate. And when I ask questions, feel free to answer with your perspective. But in general, I want to present the perspective, because the feedback we got when we didn't do that from people in the past is they couldn't follow the perspective being presented. And just to quickly touch on, Richard, free thinking, there is a political movement called free thinking that is different from what we call free thinking. For us, free thinking means, hone your critical thinking skills so that you can discern fact from fiction more effectively. And we have a high regard for truth. In fact, the first intention that we should all be intending to do is to be the best version of ourselves, be fair, and seek truth. And so those three are all kind of tied for importance. The intentions are in priority order, and that's the number one most important one. So we hold the truth very high in terms of importance. That said, I do think that it's important that everybody be able to trust their own judgment. But I also think it's important to help people learn to think more critically and discern fact from fiction more effectively than most people in society today can do. And so that was part of why I started the organization, is to help people think for themselves, but think more effectively for themselves. And I think, Richard, probably what you're frustrated with is that there's a lot of misinformation, and there are studies that show that fake news travels faster than real news. And that becomes problematic for those of us that hold the truth in high regard, because, lies travel faster than truth, and the truth seems to be losing that battle. And so part of why I'm starting this organization is to create a group of people that hold the truth in high regard and want to help truth spread faster by making people more resilient to disinformation. So Ellis, go ahead.
Hi, it's me. Thanks to the gentleman bringing that up. So we will be having a vaccination meetup upcoming. So just join us on Discord if you like, and you can continue there. We all talk about everything in between meetups as well. Thank you.
So Ocean, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to hold on until I've actually presented something, because I want the questions to be about something that was presented rather than the pre-conversation. Is that okay?
Well, actually, I wanted to very quickly respond to about the truth is Richard said the truth is it should be expressed in mathematical formula. I mean, I'm sure that's true in some sense. In other sense, it's not true. How can you tell the greatness of the music of the Beethoven in mathematical formula?
Yeah, Ocean,
Yeah.
I'd rather focus on that in the online community, if you don't mind, because it's a little bit off topic for like, a little bit off topic for tonight's discussion. Is that okay?
Oh, no worries.
Cool. And I hear where you're coming from, Ocean. Even mathematicians say that mathematics doesn't have a solid logical basis. So there's that, but that's a whole nother discussion for another night. Although I generally agree with Richard, I can poke holes and agree with him at the same time. Even though I agree with the spirit of everything you said, Richard. So that said,
And also, I want to make a few sentences about the fake news. The entire world, not just people, certain conspiracy theorists, but the mainstream news. President Obama himself admit that Gulf of Tonkin incident was the government false flag. So it was a conspiracy fact, which was admitted by the president of the United States. So mainstream news, government put out fake news or lies all the time. So we should never forget about it.
so tonight we're going to talk about justice and fairness. I guess let me share my screen. I have a doc that I think Ellis shared. It was kind of put together. I wrote part of it way in advance and then part of it last night and then stitched the two together today. So basically, we had a conversation on fairness a while back, and in general, people agreed, although I would be curious to see if this audience agrees as well, that people have an inherent sense of fairness. But I'm going to talk about some of the weak points in that intuition for what's fair and what's unfair. And that, we agreed that fairness was important to us all. I think that, most people value fairness, particularly because we want to be treated fairly. And so that makes us want to treat others fairly so that we get that reciprocity. And then we'll talk about socioeconomic unfairness if we have time, if we get to it. That's at the end of the essay. And then, generally, like, we had an agreement that each of us should do our part to try to make the world more fair. And that comes into another short essay that I wrote about why I don't like the saying life's not fair, because a lot of people use that saying to sort of excuse themselves from needing to be fair, saying, well, life's not fair, why should I be fair? And I don't agree with that. I think that, yeah, sure, maybe life's not fair. There's like natural disasters and hurricanes and earthquakes and all kinds of things that happen to people that's not fair, but shouldn't each one of us do our part to be more fair so that we make the world a more fair place than it is before we made our decisions that were more fair? So that said, I want to talk about justice and fairness. There was a discussion on the topic of the evening about whether or not justice was the same as fairness. I was originally saying that I think they are more or less synonyms, but then I looked up the dictionary definitions to be really specific. And actually they're subtly different. And so I put the definitions of justice here. Basically it's about not just what's right and wrong, but about how you enforce what's right and wrong. And so if you look at the definitions of fairness, it's the state, condition, or quality of being fair. In other words, free from bias or injustice. And notice there's a little bit of synonym going on there where it says injustice. Free from injustice. But remember, injustice, if you're talking about something that's unfair, that means that justice was enforced on you, or an even-handedness. So I guess what I would say is that both justice and fairness value fairness. Justice is just including the enforcement of fairness. And so, maybe we can use those terms not synonymously, but understanding that there's there's really the desire to be fair amongst both of them. It's just that justice includes enforcing that fairness on society, which I think is important. And I'll talk about where I think fairness should be enforced and does not need to be enforced, and the different ways of enforcing it, I should say. So I guess I think that we can all inherently discern what's fair and what's not fair given our current beliefs. Mind you, that comment of given our current beliefs is a big one, because we all have different understandings of the truth, and we all have different perspectives on which we see the world. And there's that old saying about, like, if you take three blind men touching an elephant and one is touching the trunk and one is touching the leg, I forget exactly how it goes, and then another is touching the ear, they're all going to say the elephant is a very different thing. But that's because they're seeing their own perspective of the elephant. And so by seeing different perspectives on the world, we can come to different conclusions about what's fair, even if, objective reality really tells you, there is a fair and unfair decision to be made, like answer to be made or decision to be made in that situation. So I'm basically going to say that, current beliefs are not, if our current beliefs are not grounded in reality, then our sense of fairness can lead us to be unfair. And that's why I think it's really important to be grounded in reality before we try to be fair or unfair, because if we're not grounded in reality, we can make the wrong decision. And I'm going to give an example of this. So let's say you're the CEO of a company and you're deciding whether or not you should move the headquarters because you can save a lot of money moving the headquarters. And right now the company needs money. You're about to run out of money pretty soon. And so you want to move the headquarters to sort of save on your expenses. Well, your head of HR protests and says, well, I don't think it's a good idea, but you interrupt them and say, look, we need to save this money to save the company to keep everybody employed. Well, you announce the big move a couple of days later, and only 2 to 3 weeks after announcing the big move, you start seeing employees from all functions leaving the company, and you run into your HR manager's office and you demand to know what's going on. Well, I tried to warn you about that, he said, but you said your decision was final and we didn't have time to talk about it. Our employees are deeply connected with the community, and I didn't think they'd be likely to move with the headquarters if it moved, and it seems that I was right. So the company basically had to declare bankruptcy shortly thereafter because too many employees left and the company failed. Well, here your intention was good. You were trying to be fair. You were trying to save everybody's jobs. You had good intentions, which I would actually argue that most people that cause harm have good intentions. There was an ancient Greek philosopher, I think it was one of the Socratic dialogues, that said, every man thinks he's a fair man. Every man thinks he's just. The problem is misunderstandings. And the problem is when we don't see the truth clearly, what we think is just is not actually just. And really what happened was you had a misunderstanding about what the right path forward was. So in order to know what's actually fair, we need to see the truth clearly. And how can we do that? And this is where I'm going to let you use a time machine, and we're going to go back in time to the beginning of that process that you were making as the CEO. And we're going to play out a different scenario where you're using the Freethinker Institute's first 4 intentions. So first intention is to actively seek the truth, be the best version of ourselves with an eye towards being as fair as possible. In this example, that means seeking the truth about what the company's options are to save money. So moving is one option and you think it's the best option. So now, rather than just succumbing to confirmation bias, which is our natural inclination to think what we believe right now is absolutely right, you're going to actually seek alternate beliefs. Look for beliefs that disagree with your current beliefs. And that really embodies the first intention of the Freethinker Institute. So the second intention is that we need to transparently share our beliefs to the extent that we can trust someone. So you tell your team, look, I think we need to move the HQ. We need to move the headquarters. And the second part of the second intention is to listen to other people's ideas with an open mind. So then you put on your listening cap and you say, all right, so when your HR director speaks up and says, hey, look, I don't think we should move the company, you say, well, tell me why, like, what's the concern? And you recall all the community service activities that you've always championed to keep people rooted in the community. And you realize this guy's right. Like, people aren't going to want to move, right? I'm listening to you with an open mind. So what's our other option? What are our other options? So you go to the CFO and you say, look, how can we save money? We're running out of money. The CFO says, look, we can borrow money against money that our vendors owe us. And now suddenly we can have an influx of cash that we weren't going to have for months. And so we're going to actually stop the company from going bankrupt in the short term without having to move the headquarters. But then you have a shortfall of revenue after you've now sold off your debt, which is called factoring for anyone that's not in the financial services industry like I was for a decade. Your chief revenue officer says, look, I have a lot of new prospects. I have a lot of people that want to buy from us. It's just going to take time to close those deals. The CFO is going to buy me that time. We're actually going to make a lot of money as long as we can hang on for the next couple of months. So now, by listening with an open mind to your leadership team, you've got a plan, right? And now everybody's heard the plan resonates with everyone, it makes sense. And now you've got a more clear picture of the truth, the actual truth, not your perspective of the truth, which was a misunderstanding in the first place. Now, what I'm going to argue is that while this is a specific scenario, I did not cherry pick this scenario. This is actually a scenario that if you go through the process of, and actually let me finish the third intention, which is that you need to evaluate the plan's chances of success as well as what each person is saying. And that requires using your critical thinking skills, which is the third intention. And so you need to evaluate everybody's opinions and say, does this make sense? Does this hold water? Well, can we borrow against money that people owe us? Yeah, there's companies that do that. Does the chief revenue officer know whether or not he's going to be able to close a lot of deals? Look, he's been in this job for a decade. He knows when he's going to close new deals. So you use your critical thinking skills, and you, as the CEO, say, look, these are my leaders and they know what they're doing. And it sounds like a pretty good plan. So all of this basically lets everybody voice their opinion. It brings the best ideas up to the top because you were looking to seek truth rather than to be right, which I think a lot of us have a tendency to want to be right. And it's a natural psychological inclination. That's what confirmation bias is a psychological term for wanting to be right about our current beliefs. And I think it's really important that we consciously check that in order to be fair, and look to listen to other people with an open mind so that we can get a clear read on the truth. And we also have to transparently share our beliefs, because if we don't share our beliefs, no one will be able to point out when they're wrong. And so transparently sharing our beliefs helps air out what we think and what might be true, and helps get the truth, if we have it, more front and center. And then everyone else listening to us with an open mind will consider that we may have the truth that they don't have yet. Will, did you have a question?
No, it's more, I just wanted to make a point later, perhaps about that feeling of wanting to be right. I was just having a thought about that. So I don't know if now's the appropriate time to say it or not, just briefly, but probably a bit of an interruption if I say it now.
If you don't mind, do it. Like, I'm going to ask a question and maybe do it at that point. We'll have a pause. If it's not a clarifying question, is that okay?
Yep. Yeah, sure,
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, I always love your comments, Will. So I do want to hear it. So definitely take a note down to bring it up later, because I want to hear it. So now basically you can see that the CEO, if he was a member of the Freethinker Institute and was operating on the first four intentions, the last intention by the fourth intention, sorry, is to increase happiness and decrease harm. And that's what I'm going to argue is essentially being fair, is if you're increasing happiness and decreasing harm. And I'm going to be a little more specific in that. I have a concept that I call net present positivity. And let me see if, I guess, net present positivity is basically looking at all the happiness and harm in someone's life that you're going to, influence in a decision, and adding up all the happiness and adding up all the harm with what's called the discounting factor, meaning like if it's further in the future, it doesn't get as much value because it's less likely to be an accurate prediction. But essentially what you're doing is taking all the happiness and harm that you're going to influence in people's lives and trying to increase the amount of happiness and decrease the amount of harm net. And I'd argue that when we have this intuitive sense of what's fair, that's essentially what we're doing. It's just that I'm describing it in a slightly more scientific, to use Richard's point, although it's not totally scientific, because happiness, and actually even the way that I describe happiness, it can only be described by the person feeling happiness, and same with harm. It can only be described by the person feeling the harm. So it's a self-appointed definition of, I get to decide when I'm happy, which for me, happiness means achieving the goals that I want to set out, and the satisfaction that I get from achieving the goals that I set out. And harm is when I feel harmed. And then we can go into more, there's a little bit more nuance to that definition that we'll go into, if not tonight, another night. That said, I'm going to skip over some of this. So notice that the truth for the decision maker, the truth is that for a decision maker, it's actually far more important that they practice the four intentions rather than that they have all the good ideas. If you'll notice in my scenario, you as the CEO didn't have either one of the good ideas that were going to save the company, right? It was your CRO and your CFO that got the ideas that saved the company, but it was the good judgment of everyone in the room who could see the value and the truth in those ideas. And so taking consensus in general from a group of people who can think for themselves and think critically is going to help you come to a more clear picture of the truth and picture of what's fair, ability to make a decision about what's most fair for the group as a whole. So that's, I guess, what I would posit. And I guess, I wanted to ask people, I used an example of like two scenarios, right? One scenario where the person made an ego-based decision where he was just wanting to be right. And then the other, he or she was just wanting to be right. And then the other where they used the four intentions. Can anyone think about an example in their lives? And if I'm going to give like 30 seconds or so for anyone to come up with an example in their lives where using the first four intentions would have come to a better decision and a more clear vision of the truth when you have what is now hindsight in 2020. And if no one else comes up with an example, I'll give one of myself, but I want to hear someone else sort of come up with an example where, listening with an open mind, transparently sharing what you believed, having an active goal of seeking truth rather than being right, where you would have ended up in a better decision or a better place by making a better decision, which would have been more fair for all involved. Ocean, do you have an example?
Well, I don't have example, except I want to very quickly express my honest response to this particular example. And the CEO is admirable because he cares about the fairness and caring about the employees. But in the actual real world, and as far as I know, most CEO doesn't give a crap about their employees. Like a CEO of the Burger King makes like a $30 or $40 million or something like that, which is like 1,000 times more than hardworking people, labor soldiers working on the field. And obviously, the CEO doesn't give a crap about all the employees he's exploiting. And
this is way off topic.
Yes.
Man.
Yeah, that's why I'm fascinated if there's such a CEO actually existing in this world, or this is some kind of a fictional story or something. I hope so,
Yeah.
but that's my honest response.
So Ocean, I hear you, and I would argue that, having spent, probably more than half of my career in corporate America, a lot of decision makers are very ego driven and they would rather be right than do the right thing. They think that what the right thing is the right thing for them, and that they should do what's in their own best interest and not worry about other people's best interests. So I'm not going to tell you that's not true because I've seen a lot of people like that, but I will also say I've read a lot of books on leadership, and one of them says that the people who are the most successful in general are the givers, the ones that give to other people. And so it's not a cold, hard, fast rule that all leaders and managers are ego driven. I've worked with a lot of very altruistic leaders in my career, but I've also worked with a lot of ego driven leaders. So you have both types. What I want to do with the Freethinker Institute is get people to be thinking more about seeking truth and being fair, rather than about, and the example that I gave in the first decision was the ego-driven leader. So anyway, I want to let people that have an example to give speak up, or people that have clarifying questions about anything I presented. So April, you're next. You're on mute.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm thinking of something actually very personal. 'Cause this is, if I had a time machine, boy, I'm thinking of romantic and also just platonic relationships I had in my early 20s, and I was of the mindset of keeping certain things, like private, which, you have to balance. But at the same time, when you talk about what's really going on and you're honest with other people, you get the other perspectives. And because by keeping everything within whatever relationship you're in, you're basically having that self, what you said, the ego-driven perspective. And I still, obviously I think like every relationship's different. And yes, it's good to keep certain things private, but even if it's a therapist or, just a friend of a friend of a friend, it's good to get those outside perspectives. And Oive with my, definitely my 20s been vastly different if I had done that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And that's part of why, we have the Freethinker Institute membership, because we want to create a community of people that can rely on each other from a place of trust to give honest feedback. And I already use some of the leadership team members to get feedback because, I've had some tense conversations with people, and I show, like in confidence that conversation to someone that I trust and say, look, give me honest feedback. Like, am I off base here? And sometimes I am off base and I want that feedback. But the truth is, some friends, especially the ones who say they're really loyal to their friends, won't tell you the truth. They'll tell you you're right, even when you're wrong. For me, the friends that I want to surround myself with are the ones that hold truth more dear to our friendship, because they know that I hold truth more dear to our friendship, and that what's going to hold us together is the truth, rather than them lying to me about when I'm making a mistake. Right? I don't want people to tell me sweet lies. I want people to tell me where I'm wrong. And, people that I trust to tell me the truth are the ones that I hold the closest to me. Speaking of which, oh no, this is someone else. Sorry. Oded, so go ahead with your question or comment or example.
Yeah, the example was I was working for a big aerospace company. And the end of the year, they make big profit. And they can give better dividends for the shareholder. They can buy back stocks. They can get bonus for the employee. Or they can do all of the above. I was thinking that if they buy back the stocks, the company will be strong and I get more job security. If the company give the money for dividend, the shareholder will be happy and the value of the share of the company will go up. And this also may be good for me as employee. What I prefer is actually to get more money in my pocket right now. So the issue of fairness and truth is issue of time. And this is the element that you miss in this discussion. What may be good now may be bad later. If the company will put all the money into salaries, the company may not be able to go forward. So this is actually in my particular case, most of the money will go to the shareholder. Some money go to the employee, but they don't bought back their shares. It's looked to me kind of a compromise. And my question is it a formula, the truth that you say, that is fair, how to do about profit sharing? Is it formula that is good and fair for everyone?
So I guess.
Hi, Garrett. Just
yeah.
a moment before you go ahead.
Yeah.
Tony was having trouble. He doesn't know how to raise his hand. So maybe you can add him to your list of talkers.
Okay, great. Tony, do you know when he put his hand and when he asked Ellis?
A while back.
Okay, then we'll go for Tony after Oded, if you don't mind, Mike, and then we'll go to Mike. So Oded, I do think I actually addressed the significance of time in that I called net present positivity the sum of positive and negative interactions throughout one's life. So it literally is all the way up until death. What are the positive and negative influences? Now, I think a lot of people think very short term, like you self-described that you were thinking short term, I want more money in my pocket, but you also acknowledge that if you were thinking longer term, maybe some of the other options would have been better for you. Whether or not there's a magic formula that says how much to give for stock buyback versus dividend versus employee bonuses. I'm not gonna try to venture that one without doing some research and studying. So I don't have an answer for you tonight for that. But I do think that I was in the in the formula that I was giving of net present positivity, it takes into account all of the lives, like the entire lifespan of every life that's influenced by a decision. So it does take into account the consideration over time. What would need to be studied is, out of those three options, how much happiness and harm is caused throughout people's lives that actually influences their happiness and harm. And studies show that, you know, once someone makes over, back then 75K a year, now probably about 90K a year, money doesn't buy happiness over 90K. And there are other studies that say it does, but it's a logarithmic impact, meaning, you know, the more you go up, the less happiness that you get. So in the best case, it's a logarithmic increase. And so one of the goals of the Freethinker Institute is a very ambitious goal that won't happen in my lifetime, but I think hopefully will happen after it, is that I want to create a world that where everybody basically in the world makes enough money that money no longer buys happiness. And right now we're not headed in that direction. We're headed, we'll talk about later if we get the time, about the big difference between socioeconomic disparity in the last 40 to 50 years compared to prior. Socioeconomic disparity is getting wider right now than ever in history, or at least in recent history. And so, you know, I think we need to change the course of dialogue in order to make that happen. So I want to try to be part of that change, and I would love for all of you to be a part of that change together. So that said, Tony, I think, was who you said was next, Ellis. And Tony, just so you know, if you go to reactions, it might be under more, but if you go to reactions, that's where the hand raise thing is.
Oh, sorry, I was asking her how to raise a hand because I wanted to participate eventually. I have nothing right now, but thank you.
Okay, no problem. Then we'll
thinking.
let Mike go. Thanks, Tony. Did that make sense, Tony, that you go to reactions and raise hand?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, the only thing there is to recognize hand gestures, but that's probably just my system. So let's not. dwell
Oh,
on
it
it.
should be
Thank
like,
you.
it's either under more and then raise hand, or it's like on your main menu and reactions and raise hand. Should be in
Okay,
one or the other.
Thank you.
No problem. Mike, go ahead.
I want to expand on Odette's comment about money in that context, because in a way that provides a quantitative basis for comparing these things. And you brought in another concept called logarithmic compression, that money that after a certain money at past a certain amount hasn't becomes fictional and a burden rather than an advantage. And that goes back, and that is really dependent on what is truth. We normally consider some of the philosophers consider truth as a scalar, not just a scalar, but a 1-0 binary scalar. Something is either true or not true. And in reality, it's a probabilistic vector. And it's not even a probabilistic vector, it's a correlation matrix. Dependent on everything that goes on. It's worse than that. It's a tensor because it depends on the environment that the truth is in, the medium that it operates, the context that it operates. Now, our situation of what constitutes money, and if you read some of the really fiction of modern monetary theory or Ayn Rand, money is really a nonlinear, multidimensional fiction. So right now we have a situation where had we known that we were going to hit, and we probably should have known, that printing all this quantitative easing was going to lead to double-digit inflation, And the inflation is really nonlinear because we say it's 7%, but the price of gasoline has doubled. The price of lumber is up 300%. So we're talking about a very nonlinear thing. Now, added to that, with inflation, the cost of money and interest rate has gone up artificially. So that's going to mean that that real property is better to have than money, because it's the money you have is going to be worth less. But that's not independent either, because if people can't finance the real property, we will have a deleveraging of inflation. So whether to sell your house and move into your car now has some interesting implications. Whether to free up money right now, so in some formats, so when everything gets deleveraged, you can pick up multi-million-dollar properties, huge apartment buildings for 5 cents on the dollar, is another element, and that all ties into hindsight. Now,
Hello, hi, Mike.
one closing thing.
Okay, yes.
There's a guy and a gal, two people wrote a book. Rogoff was one of them, that says this time it's different, which tells how predictable all this stuff was.
Hello?
So someone's not on mute. If you can, Jeffrey or Ellis, if you can see who that is, and mute them. I'm trying to. Thanks. So I have to get my other screen up. So, Mike, I hear you. I guess for me, some truths about objective reality are binary. Like the chair that I'm sitting on exists, while it's 99% air. Yes, it exists, right? It's 99% space, but it exists. I'm sitting on it. That's an objective fact, in my opinion. Some philosophers will argue with that. I won't argue with them. I'll just disagree with them. So I do think that there are objective facts, but that's kind of more of a, I think I guess that is kind of a precursor to like agreeing that seeing the truth more clearly is a good thing. But I would argue that for practical purposes, seeing the truth more clearly, and I do think that there is an objective reality out there and that we can better understand it. There are also subjective truths, which each of us decide for ourselves, which in the case that I gave, each of the employees had their own subjective truth about whether or not they would move with the company. And that was their decision to decide whether or not they would choose to move. It wasn't an objective truth, but it was each person's decision to be able to choose for themselves what they wanted. So I would argue those subjective truths are still reality. Each person gets to decide subjective truths for themselves as long as they don't conflict with objective reality, which theirs didn't. So I'd argue there actually is an objective truth. It's just trying to get to a clear understanding of it that helps us be more fair. And so that's really what I was trying to get at, is that, and I do agree with you that it's probabilistic, Mike. So it is probabilistic because, there is a slightly small chance that my whole chair will have all of its matter contact its antimatter and it'll just disappear and then it won't exist. But it's so unlikely that, it's not worth worrying about, basically. And so I guess, I do want to get on to the next question, and I'm going to make this one a poll if I can, and have people write it in the chat, because there are a lot of questions, and we're at almost 8 o'clock and we're only going until 9 o'clock, and I can't run late, unfortunately, because I sleep at 9 o'clock and it takes me a while to wind down from these events. So let me just ask, do people—
May I ask something?
Yeah, go ahead.
About inflation that
Yeah.
Mike talked about. Actually, our tax system is very progressive. That means if inflation go high, you pay more tax, and more of your money will go to the public domain, which is good. The same true if your property go up, you pay more property tax, and this make California going out of the deficit. That means what you see is actually inflation is good for the people.
That's not quite right, because the other thing that Mike said that's very accurate is that those that own property, which most people who are very wealthy own stock in companies, they own houses, they own paintings, art, they own wine collections. All of those things retain their value really well during inflation. So all of the things that wealthy people invest in, wealthy people don't keep money in a bank account. You're not going to find many wealthy people with millions of dollars in a bank account. They're smarter than that, right? They invest their money in appreciating assets. And by doing so, they actually profit more from inflation because those appreciating assets go up in value even faster. So actually, Odette, if you don't mind, I'm going to disagree on that point. But it is a little bit of a digression, because this isn't like, I'm not here to create a class war, although I think that one might be going on. That's not the point of the conversation. And I will get more into sort of class war type material later on in the event if we get enough time for it. But we may not get enough time for it.
Can I ask a quick question before we move on? I have a very quick question.
Very quick, Ocean.
Yeah, you asked us to join your movement of lessening the gap between the ultra rich and the rest of us. I agree. I would love to join, but can you tell us how? Because in the last 40 years, there are countless number of people who had the exact same idea and politically active, but they all fail completely. Nothing is it's getting worse. So what you offer? In what way what you're offering is different than rest of those people who attempt to do exactly like that?
Maybe they shared too much too soon, Ocean, and I'm not going to, but I'll tell you, if you join my crusade, I think we got a shot. So I'm gonna not answer that one, Ocean, sorry. But I will tell you that good philosophy is a part of it, and I think spreading good philosophy is a key part of what will change people's minds. I do have other plans for the future, but I don't talk about those. But one step at a time. Like the step right now is to get people thinking for themselves. It is a multi-step process, but the step right now is to get people thinking for themselves and improve their critical thinking skills. And if we can get past that step, then I'll be ready to tell you the next step once we do. Help me get past that step and getting people thinking for themselves and thinking more clearly, discerning fact from fiction, and then we can talk about the next step. So
okay, I'll join after I examine what you have to say, but thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So
I think Robert wanted to say something before you go on, or
yeah, I mean, we're gonna like never move forward if we don't move forward. So I do want to kind of limit the number of people, and he put his hand down, but I did want to go to the next question because we still have several questions and still a lot more material to get through, and it's already almost 8 o'clock. So
no problem.
yeah. So I'm curious whether or not people agree that it is kind of an inherent ability. Like, do we all have a pretty good sense of like whether something is fair or not? Like, and I'd love people to answer that in the chat about whether or not they agree that they can tell what's fair or not. Given your knowledge of the world and the people that you're influencing, do you generally have a good sense of what is the most fair thing to do? Or is that just a baffling concept in a lot of cases? And feel free to speak up if you want, or
Oh, can I say something now for this topic?
yeah, if you want to talk about whether or not.
Okay, I mean, at a certain level, yeah. You know, for example, if you and I go to the McDonald's and we pay the same amount, and if you get the full hamburger, and if I get half the hamburgers, then of course I will know I'm not treated fairly at the surface level. But I don't think, in generally speaking, most people are not aware, because if they came to aware that they have been not treated fairly, and they've been exploited and manipulated by the system, and their corporations, then we had already physical violent revolutions, but people put up with it because partly because they're ignorant, and and partly because ignorant, and they get used to being exploited, and they don't know what the fair is. So I don't think most people are aware of what the fairness is. Thanks. That's the reason.
So just to be clear, I'm not
yeah.
asking whether or not all of you are always fair. What I'm asking is whether or not, and I'm not asking whether or not everyone in the world is always fair. The clear answer to that is no. There are lots of unfair people out there. Most people are making unfair decisions all the time. The question is, given the scenario of things that you see, do you think people, if they're really looking for fairness and they're really looking to understand what is fair and what's not fair, if they're making an effort at that, do you think they have an inherent ability to decide which decision is more fair? And I would argue, yes, we do. I would argue that very often people do what's in their own best interest rather than what's fair. And in fact, psychological studies show this on a regular basis. People will regularly do what's in their own best interest, and they will often retaliate against other people in order to be more fair because they were treated unfairly. I forget the exact experiment, but it was one of those prisoner's dilemma experiments where, someone had the option to like split the money between themselves and the other person. And if they took more for themselves, the other person had the option to say, neither one of us gets anything. And they would regularly do that with real money because they wanted to say, look, if you were unfair, I'm going to just screw us both over, basically, because you were unfair. So I would argue those studies sort of inherently show that we not only have a sense of fairness, but that we will penalize even ourselves in order to punish someone for not being fair. And so I would argue we all have a sense of, look, if you and me are sitting at a table and someone gives me $100 and says, hey, Garrett, you can split this $100 however you want with the other person, and the other person can decide when you split it, whether or not either of you gets nothing, or you both get whatever you decided with. I'm going to split the $50 for each person. But a lot of people would say, look, I'm going to take 75 and I'm going to give 25 to them. But then the person who was going to get 25 will just say, look, forget it. Neither of us are getting anything. You were unfair with me. And so I would argue that's sort of evidence that people can distinguish what's fair in clear circumstances, right? That's a case where reality and truth is very clear. It's $100. It's going to be split two ways. It's not controversial.
So you're regurgitating my first example that if you and I went to the McDonald's,
exactly.
So we agree on that point.
I was.
But other times people are not what's fair, or they have no ability to retaliate what's not being fair. If you know anything about the law and the Constitution, there's no law existing in America says we have to pay income tax. But the IRS has got to reinforce it if you don't pay it. I'll pay my taxes because I'm afraid of not paying the protection money.
Hi, Ocean. Let's Garrett has to finish his presentation, and then
no problem.
Yeah, and then we've got 5 hands up, so we'll get you later, okay?
So no problem. The next thing I want to talk about is administration of justice. So first of all, I would argue that laws should prevent significant unnecessary harm. And what I mean by that is a harm that doesn't prevent a greater harm. So Buddhists and Stoics have famous quotes saying, do no harm. Well, I'm actually going to take a nuance on that. And I actually had a chat with a Buddhist monk about that. And he said, no, Garrett, like, that's not exactly what it's meant. Like, yes, that's written in a lot of Buddhist scripture, but actually, like, when I gave the example of what about a school shooter that's shooting children, is it okay to shoot the school shooter? There is some leniency there, and I think Buddhism largely agrees with my concept that I agree with Buddhism. It came way before me, that we should, be able to perpetrate harm where it prevents a greater harm. So if I'm going to save those school children from dying, it's okay to shoot the school shooter. And so that's where I would say preventing significant unnecessary harm that doesn't prevent a greater harm, is actually what we need to have laws against. Now, I would say criminal laws should basically focus on just that one rule. If you're not causing significant unnecessary harm, something shouldn't be illegal. We had another discussion on drugs, for example. Well, drugs, generally speaking, like if you have proper controls in place, just as much as you already have legal things like alcohol where people can be more violence prone, they can be with drugs as well. But basically, I would argue that the harm from drugs is almost entirely on the person doing the drugs. And so, when I define harm, I would say, I define the harm. And if someone is opting into drugs and they know the harm that it's going to cause them, it's not really harm because they're opting into it and they don't consider it harm. They consider it worthwhile. And so I would argue that, and I made that argument that when we talked about drugs, and I don't want to digress on that subject because it was a topic for another night, but I would make the argument that, causing significant or like preventing significant unnecessary harm is what criminal laws should be focused on. Whereas like laws like tax law should be focused on increasing net present positivity and basically doing the greater good for the most number of people. Also considering that, at most wealth is logarithmically making people happy. And, at worst, it's not at all making people happy over $100,000 a year. There are a lot of people that make over $100,000 a year. So, tax plans should acknowledge that fact. There's also it's a more nuanced argument than I'm making it out to be, which I can go into the nuance later if we have time. But if anyone is interested in that, I can go into the nuance because there are reasons to make sure there are wealthy people and very wealthy people. And I'm not against very wealthy people or about redistributing wealth equally between everyone. I don't think that's fair either. So that said, and I do actually touch on it here is that, giving some people more economic power who are better at managing money helps them expand the economy. And when you expand the economy, there's more wealth for everybody. And so the truth is, like right now, even if you split all the wealth from the wealthiest people down to the poorest equally, not everybody would be making 100,000 a year. Whereas if you fast forward 50 or 100 years from now, we will almost definitely be in a situation where in modern day dollars, we'll be able to do that. So the idea of a situation 50 to 100 years from now that we could have that everybody makes enough money that money no longer buys happiness is very realistic 50 to 100 years from now, even if it's not today. With that said, I want to let people ask a few questions, and then I'm going to go ahead and try to present the remainder of the presentation. So Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to your question about is fairness a kind of universal thing? And I just have a question about, is there kind of like a cultural element to it? Because I think like an example would be in our society, we say it's fair. If I'm hiring someone, I have to give equal consideration to men and women and their credentials. Whereas in a more like patriarchal culture, they may say, well, men and women have different roles in society. And a lot of those say like women shouldn't take jobs like doctors or lawyers. And then within that culture, they consider that fair. But as someone, standing outside of that culture, we might consider that unfair. So I'm just curious, what is the kind of cultural foundation of fairness?
So that's a great question, Jeff. And it's one that's often used to justify subjective morals. I guess I would argue that given if everybody is following the first four intentions and has an open dialogue to better understand each other and the perspective of, what is the truth and to understand each other's perspectives, then you can come to a much more likely to have, you can come to a point where you're much more likely to have a consensus on what truth is. Now, if you were born in a society that was patriarchal and everything you've been taught since birth is that men are more important than women and men should have a voice and women shouldn't have a voice, then, like right now in Afghanistan, it's that way. And in many other parts of the world, it's that way. And if that's what you're born with growing up from the beginning, that might be your natural inclination. And it might be that society's natural inclination. And the definition of what they consider fair in that society is going to be based on the people that have power, right? Because women don't have a right to vote in some of those areas. So, yes, there will be subjective answers about what's fair based on culture, but I would argue given enough open-mindedness and transparency and conversation and critical thinking skills, I think we would come to very similar conclusions after enough open-minded conversation. And so I would argue that there is an answer, but we don't get to that answer right away. We get to that answer in the long term through compassion, open-minded dialogue, conversation, transparently sharing our beliefs and listening to other people's beliefs with an open mind.
Thank
Does that
you.
answer your question?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
Sure. Robert.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar where, yeah, I think one person's idea of fairness can be another person's idea of oppression. And I don't know, I think, I don't know if people would come to the same, come to agreement if they chat about it long enough. I think that's why we have things like governments and legal systems to kind of determine those things for us, even if those systems are flawed. I think sometimes they're needed because people won't come to agreement, right? So yeah, and I don't know, I think each person has their own view of fairness, and I think it's based on their own life experiences. Unless you're able to really understand every person's life experiences, I don't know if you'll fully understand what is fair to them. And there's so many different meanings and interpretations. Even the word fair can be pretty vague depending on the situation. I know with like things like social justice, there's fairness that means equality. And then that was upgraded for fairness to mean equity. And then there's fairness that means justice, like the current legal system. And then there's fairness that means social justice, which is sort of changing society to make it better for everyone. So I don't know, yeah, I just feel like fairness itself can be tricky just because there are so many interpretations. But yeah, and just with going back to the example of the CEO, I don't know if the issue is that the CEO doesn't have a concept of fairness or that they weren't a critical thinker. I think the problem in that case might be related to the sort of extreme consolidation of power there. Like the CEO gets to make that decision. It's not like a board decision or a company decision. And to me, that seems incredibly unfair, right? Like, so yeah, I don't know. I think to say that people agree on fairness is a difficult thing to say when I don't think people can necessarily understand each other's circumstances or what their life experiences.
Let me try to make it more clear for you, Robert. So when I say people agree on fairness, let's say the scenario that I gave where I'm given $100 sitting at a table with you, and I get to decide how the $100 is split between me and you get to decide whether or not either one of us get the money. What would you consider fair in that scenario?
I don't understand.
I'm given $100. I can choose how much of it I give to you. And if you don't like it, you can make sure that neither of us get any money. And so what do you think would be fair?
None of that seems fair, I guess.
No, that's the scenario we're in. We're just in a game, right? It's a game, and we're in an experiment, and these are the rules. So you have to like, let's say it's you with the $100, and you get to decide how much you give me. What do you think is fair to give me when I have that decision to make sure both of us get no money if I want?
I think the situation is unfair.
I mean,
yeah, but in that scenario, if I understand it correctly, so the person who's at the whim of the one with the power, i.e. the one with the $100, the one who's at their mercy, you could say, has the right to veto the whole arrangement. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
So Robert, if you don't give me $50, I'm going to make sure neither one of us gets money, because to me, what's fair is that we split the money evenly. That's how I see life, is that if you get $100 for free and you get to choose how much you're going to give me, if you don't give me at least 50, I'm going to actually make sure you don't get anything.
Yeah, so the $100 itself is the unfair thing, I would say.
Well, it's a
Like
psychological.
putting us in that position is unfair.
Robert,
Taking away.
you're missing the whole point. The whole point is it's a psychological experiment that shows how employment and employer relationships work. It's a very isolated scenario where fairness is extremely clear, and you know the powers and the checks and balances on power are extremely clear. So actually, it's a very fair scenario because both people have power, and one has the power to either be fair or not, and the other has the power to either agree with whether or not what they did was fair. So it's actually isolating the very, and I don't agree with a lot of psychological experiments. Most of them I think are not that worthwhile, but this one is really good because what it does is it hones in on people's innate sense of fairness. And what it showed is that people inevitably would make sure that no one got money unless the first person dividing up the money was pretty fair. And so what it
Garrett,
shows is
help
that
me.
everybody does. Ocean, we have like 5 people with their hands up. Please, like,
Okay.
let's let people speak. So what it shows is that people do have an inherent sense of fairness, and it's very clear that if they feel like their fairness is violated, this has even been done with apes, right? They had a scenario of where a researcher was giving food to apes, and when they underfed one ape and overfed the other ape, the ape that got less food would throw the food back to the researcher, basically saying, you know, screw you, man. If you're going to give me less, I'm going to throw it at you.
Yeah,
They were monkeys.
so that's missing the point though, that
Sorry, monkeys.
the unfair part of that situation is the researcher, right?
The point is
Not
not
the
always being
monkeys
unfair,
themselves,
Robert.
but-
It's whether or not people can sense whether or not something is fair. And I would argue we all can sense whether or not something is fair in the extreme examples.
Yeah, but so
If
that's,
a
I'm
politician
not
gets away
arguing
with
whether or not
murder-
people have a sense of fairness. I'm saying that everyone's sense of fairness can be significantly different, especially given very significantly different circumstances. Like if you're the CEO, you have all that power over the company. Sure, the company can start a union or all quit, but you still get to make that decision. The unfair part, I guess, is the system. So that's why I said the $100 is the unfair part. The system that everyone is put into is the unfair thing. So like something like social justice is about trying to create systems that aren't unfair, that aren't innately unfair. So you don't get one person the $100, you do something different because that system is innately unfair. Anyways,
Yeah, I agree with Robert. Yeah.
I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's on point. I think what Garrett is saying is like it's a difference. It's not so much about the system per se. It's about an innate sense of fairness in human beings.
Right.
And somebody mentioned cultural differences. Well, that's subject to the cultural interpretation of what is the norm. However, there is an innate sense of fairness also demonstrated in other primates, that it's universal, irrespective of the system that you find yourself in, whether that's fair or not. You've still got a gauge that will bump you towards what's justified and what's not. So it's not about the system, it's about the innate human behavior that recognizes the system.
is it possible to be fair in an unfair system?
Of course, there have been huge numbers of people that have been fair and unfair systems, right? Like most of the people who have been, revolutionaries fighting against authorities that were oppressive regimes were fair people in an unfair system. They were trying to make a more fair replacement for an unfair system. So there are lots of examples of people who, grew up in unfair systems and made them more fair. There are lots of people, there's a company, I forget the name of it, it's a payments company where the CEO said, look, I'm going to pay my lowest paid employees $75,000 a year. And he decided to make a more fair company in a very capitalist system that usually tries to pay the least amount it could get away with. He paid way above market rate to pay people more fairly. And he just said, this is how I'm going to do it. And it was,
I guess the better question is, how often does it happen? Maybe, yeah, you can be fair, but
I mean, it's
having
not,
so much
for me, it's
consolidated
not about,
power makes it very easy to be unfair.
I'm not here to evaluate like the frequency at which something happens. I'm here to evaluate whether or not it is an inherent ability of human beings to discern fairness from unfairness. And I would argue that it is. I would welcome anyone to give an example where increasing net present positivity is something that they would consider unfair, and decreasing net present positivity is something that they would argue is fair. So if anyone wants to come up with an example like that, I would love to hear it. That said, there are a lot of hands up, so I want to let Will go.
Well, thanks, Garrett. I was just going to mention something that you said a while back about the need to be right, how we have this sort of, we have a burning desire to be correct. And I notice that a lot in these discussions. I mean, I jump into a Zoom meeting virtually every morning here in Australia, and I'm doing, I'll just jump into whatever the topic is. And I notice how often disagreements break out, and often they're not really, they don't matter. We'll argue about things that don't really matter. But it's like we have this innate need to be correct, and it fascinates me. Like debates and arguments fascinate me, like why we need to be right. And I think perhaps we need that. Maybe we need to argue even when it doesn't matter. And I think of the example of I was in the merchant navy, and the captain of the ship, before he was could be the captain, they would test him on various scenarios. They'd throw everything at him, like, okay, you're in a 15, say, what would you guys say? You're in like a 50-foot swell. You've lost engines. There's a fire on the aft of the ship. You've got a passenger on the ship that needs urgent medical attention, but the helicopter can't land to pick them up because you've lost radio contact. What do you do? So they put them through this sort of ringer of pressure. And I think perhaps there's something innate in us that we need to argue even when it doesn't matter. We're trying to hone, for academia's sake, to hone our intellectual abilities, and sometimes it does matter. So it's like a game. And I'm thinking with all animals play games when they're juvenile. They'll play, they'll wrestle, they'll play fight, because sometimes it does matter. And I wonder if these sort of even intellectual discourse that we have, and we're all arguing and defending our points vehemently when it doesn't really matter, like, what did Kant say about what is a categorical imperative, for instance, which I still can't get my head around what it is, but people will argue about that for an hour. And it's like, what does it matter? But perhaps it does matter that we hone our intellectual skills, and because sometimes it does matter. So I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think that's a great point, Will.
I wish I could just withdraw all that.
No, it was very well said and super important. And I do think that that's part of why people have the need to debate. I think we all have a hunger to find truth. We all have an innate hunger to find the truth. And part of the reason we debate is to better discern what truth is. It's just that we need to listen with an open mind to other people's ideas and share our own ideas with transparency and get better critical thinking skills, so we can let the truth surface, by listening to an open mind when other people have a better version of truth. And so all I'm trying to do is help make that debate be more healthy and more focused on listening to other people's perspectives, and being open to them, and even acknowledging that, if I listen to something else that's more true than what I currently believe, cool, now I'm more right than I was before, because I believe a new truth that is actually more right than my old belief. And so there's nothing wrong with saying we're wrong, because immediately we're right again. We're just more right than we were before. So I try to encourage people to have that approach, that healthy debate with an open mind, because that's how we become more right.
I mean, just very quickly, Garrett, because one that you can relate to, and I don't want to go off on a tangent, but yesterday I was in a meeting with an professor of evolutionary biology, and I happened to bring up this thing which you and I think you had a whole topic on a couple of months back, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, about my premise that we will never explain how something emerged from nothing or alternatively existed infinitely without first cause. And some of the people there, and I get it time and time again, because I've put that forward to meetings about 100 times now over the years. And people just instantly start jumping up and down, and within a second they've made up their mind. I know you've given it vast thought, you've done a paper on it, you know, so obviously you've thought about it, but they just come to a conclusion in less than a second and say, we can work it out. And we just want to go with our view of the world, and we'll defend it vehemently, even when it's the biggest mystery of all known mysteries.
Right. No, I agree with you, Will. I think people jump to conclusions way too quickly. And with that
Thanks
said,
a
I
lot.
want to let Reddy go, and then I'm gonna go through a little bit more material if we can, and then
Garrett,
go ahead.
it's about 8:20, so I suggested in the chat, if any ladies want to speak, we haven't heard from any tonight, and if anybody who is new, who hasn't spoken, who wants to, just put up your hands and we'll get to you.
Yep, I think Reddy is new, and I would love other people that haven't spoken to speak up as well.
Cool. Thanks for having me here. There are a couple of things that I actually wanted to understand, or probably put out my thoughts on it. So again, for the point of being fair, I guess there is much more to two people actually having $100 split. I guess at least in real life, we can actually understand fairness is also by chance. I guess for example, a person being born in a rich family versus being born in a really poor family is something that happens by chance, and the success rate in both the scenarios greatly differ because of the access to different things in their lives. Being said that, I think there is a certain a country in Europe where you even though you're born in a poor family, your chance of actually being successful, again, that is debatable. What is success is debatable. That's a different story. But again, it's 58%. So I guess we all agree, the basic necessities for humans is or beyond is food, shelter, and clothing. I guess there are at least few different things that I want to actually mention here, something that this is something that we know for a long time. As you mentioned, Garrett, we all know that there is certain level of injustice that happens from the very beginning. But what do we do to actually address all these things is the bigger question. So I guess I just want to relate a couple of things that we actually see here. Money and inflation is something that we talked about. So money, as we said, is just this is something that humans created. It's an exchange for good. So for example, if I actually make my own breakfast or lunch, the necessity for me to go out and actually buy something would actually decrease, which means that I will be saving on some money. I understand that part of it, but again, the reason why I'm actually quoting preparing food is basically we all think that we since we have money, we actually have access to food outside, we go buy it. But if you prepare it, it's not necessarily something that that is difficult. Once you do it, it actually becomes much easier. So the reason why I'm actually bringing this is happiness and sadness in different scenarios is also similar to that. There's a research that actually I read some in a Harvard Business Review, where the happiness and sadness may not necessarily be as bad as we think when it actually happens. So for example, a scenario happens, and then I might have been thinking about okay, this is really, if this happens, I'll be really happy. But when it actually happens, you are less likely to be that happy when it actually happens. Similarly, it goes with the sadness as well. So the reason why I'm quoting this is anything that we think okay, can bring us happiness, with money or without money. In this case, I think someone mentioned I don't know if I should quote, but again, someone mentioned the splitting of money, in case of a person who is who wants too much, say who wants to do surgery, should we actually give them $80 versus taking 50-50? So that's again subjective, but again it comes back to the basis where happiness and sadness is measured differently from person to person. But when you actually think at a grand scale, am I being fair to the other person, depending on the circumstances that this person is in, is probably a bigger thing to consider than splitting into a 50-50 in this opinion, is my opinion. But again, anything that we think, I mean, the bigger thing is what are we doing to actually reduce anything, the injustice that we actually see in society. For example, are we actually thinking about people who are on the streets, who are begging for money or whatever, food, like whatever is the bigger question. What do we do? Like, are we actually like doing stuff that we are supposed to do is a bigger question. So I guess I just want to do I just want to end saying that, like, happiness is more subjective. It's what we think it is, and mind is something that can be controlled in different ways. So for your example of like saying like money does not buy happiness, after a certain point, yes, and looking after other people, like, is an interest that everyone should have. Is something that I wanted to conclude with. Thank you.
Yeah, great points, Reddy. And actually, you open up to the next part of the conversation that I'd like to go into about what does it mean to live in a just and fair society. And I will welcome the people that think that all fairness is completely subjective to try to poke holes in my arguments here. And I will listen with an open mind. But I guess I do agree with you, Reddy, that there's fairness by chance if you're born into a poor or rich family. And I'm going to talk about that in the next session, about ways to make that a little bit more fair, so that it's not a long-lasting unfairness. I also think that we should be thinking about how do we reduce injustice in society. And that's why I don't like the saying life's not fair, because people use that to say, I give the example when I was in middle school, like as a child, my teacher gave me a detention and he's like, Garrett, here's a detention. And I'm like, but I didn't do that. That's not fair. And he goes, Garrett, life's not fair. And I said, you know what? You're right. And I gave the example that I gave before. I'm like, there are hurricanes, there are earthquakes, and there are tornadoes. Life's not fair. Sometimes bad stuff happens to good people, but shouldn't each one of us do our part to make life a little more fair? And so why don't you do yours? And he said, all right, I won't give you a detention. So I got out of a detention that way by saying, appealing to his own natural sense of fairness. So even my middle school teacher, who at first went with an ego trip, decided to not give me a detention because he realized the logical argument was he wasn't being fair and he didn't want to be a person that was unfair. I don't think any of us want to be a person that's unfair. It's more when we don't see the truth clearly that we make unfair decisions. And a lot of cultural answers, to Jeff's point about cultural values, like a lot of cultures don't see the truth clearly because there are cultural blinders based on the cultural perspective that they come from. And, that's a part of reality. And through open dialogue of different cultures and cross-cultural interaction, like I think we can help the truth come out more clearly and help make the world a little bit more fair, to Reddy's point, which I think is super important. And I want to talk about a couple of things. One is that I'm going to go back into presenting because we're at 8:30 and I want to give a little bit of time at the end. So in society, I think, like I said, significant unnecessary harm should always be a negative. Now, if you cause significant unnecessary harm, I think there should be, criminal penalties for that. And I would welcome anyone that says all fairness is totally subjective to say, why do you justify giving significant unnecessary harm? Why should it be okay for someone to just superfluously kill another human being? Why would that be okay? Like, how do you justify that? I would argue we all have an inherent sense that unjustified murder is unfair. And so that's where I say the extreme examples become really clear. And that example of $100 and splitting it is a really, makes the example really clear. And so does the example of killing someone unnecessary without a good reason. And then the other thing I would say is that I think society should be the society that I want to live in is one where everybody can strive to achieve their personal life goals. It's one where, and this is, enshrined in the Constitution in the US of, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where we all have the right to pursue our own goals and the things that make us happy. And I would argue that in society, we should not have people be more or less likely to achieve their personal goals because of things that are completely out of their control, like whether you were born to a wealthy or a poor family. And right now in the US, for people that don't know, the school system in the US is funded by property tax, which means if you grow up in a poor neighborhood, you get a really bad education. If you grow up in a wealthy neighborhood, you get a really good education. There was, I believe it was Finland, Mayu could tell me, but it was either Finland or Sweden, I think, that basically made paying for tuition illegal, which basically said there could be no private schools, and therefore wealthy people made sure that the public school system was really good because they wanted their kids to have a good education. And well, now you have really good public schools in that country. Well, isn't that interesting? What an interesting solution. Now, I don't love that solution because I'm a free market capitalist, but I also like the fact that it gave a great education to everybody in society. And I think that's a good thing to strive for. But if I really come down to it, I think that private enterprise can innovate more in education than public, but I think there should be good oversight of government into private education. And the problem is that I think most of the people advocating for private education these days don't want any government oversight into private education, which becomes dangerous because they can become indoctrination camps on both sides of the political aisle. And it's going to happen on both sides. If one side does it, the other side's going to do it too. And the last thing we want is like more of a war going on politically than we already have. We're all human beings. We're all, we all want to be nice. I think we all want to be fair. And, it's only by listening to other people with different opinions than us that we can actually bridge gaps. And I think we need to be doing more bridging gaps rather than lighting fires. And there are too many fires lit in this country right now. We're at a very dangerous precipice. And I'd like to see it get to be a little bit better. So in terms of ways, to Reddy's point about how do we make the world more fair, I'm going to go into a couple of areas and I'm going to just cover them quickly because we are having great conversation. I want to focus on that, but I do want to at least present some ideas for conversation's sake, which is one, ending dynastic wealth. In the US, if you come from a extremely wealthy family, the next 50 generations of your family may never have to work again the rest of their lives. And for me, that seems very unfair. And so what I propose is to have a limit of how much a child can inherit from a parent with no loopholes. And there are ways to make no loopholes. For anyone that thinks that there are no ways to make no loopholes, you just haven't met someone that's smarter than the people trying to come up with the loopholes. If the people plugging the loopholes are smarter than the people making the loopholes, there are no loopholes. So that's really what it comes down to. We just need the smarter people stopping the loopholes rather than creating the loopholes. And right now the money is in creating loopholes, not stopping them. So that said, doing this could actually increase revenues very significantly. I'm just going to jump through. Anyone that wants to read the actual mathematical calculations is welcome to, but it's basically over almost $330 billion revenue source per year, which could be used for healthcare and education, which would be, a huge differentiator in terms of the amount of healthcare and education that we can provide for US citizens. This is a US scenario. I'm in the US, so that's why I use a US scenario. Although we can come up with scenarios in other parts of the world too, and I welcome people to do that and share them in the online community. The next one is to create high quality education. And I talked a little bit about that. I have an essay on education and what I think, would help the educational system. Another is to end discrimination. A lot of work has been done in the last 30 or 40 years to do that, but some of it may be undone relatively soon. So I bring it up because to me, like, discriminating people based on things they can't control, and I'm using that term very distinctly because I'm a Stoic. If someone can't control something, discriminating against them or for them, either one, is not fair, right? You don't give someone an advantage or a disadvantage for something they have no control over. And so ultimately, like, people's performance should influence their success, not their the family that they were born into, and their level of effort basically, and their performance. And that said, I think that purchasing from more ethical companies is a small thing that each one of us can do, and if we all do it, it's a big thing. And what that means is look up the companies you work with. There's a great little app called A Better World, which did what I wanted to do, but they did it first, which is they rate companies in terms of how ethical they are. And then what that does is it helps you know that you're spending money with ethical companies. What that does is if everybody starts doing that, the ethical companies make more money and the unethical companies dry up and go away. And suddenly all those leaders, the CEO of the unethical company, to Robert's point earlier, well, the thing that's unfair is that CEO has all the power. Well, it's not just that he has all the power, it's that a CEO that's an egotist was put into power, right? And that all of his customers keep buying from him, even though he's an egotist. Really, the way to make that right is, as consumers, to spend our money with ethical companies that are doing the right thing. And if we can see the truth clearly and know which companies are more ethical and we spend our money at those companies, we empower those companies and we make them more influential, and they replace and take over all of the unethical companies. Unfortunately, a lot of people just want the cheapest price, and usually the cheapest price is not at the most ethical companies. And so for those that have the disposable income to think about it, I really encourage you to look at which companies are more ethical and spend your money there. And then the last thing is to vote in incorruptible representatives. And this is not the only answer, to Ocean's point. It's not the only answer, but you know, the one that I can share with now is that we ultimately need to vote into political offices people that are committed to and have a track record for making the world more fair. And studies have shown that, and I will try to post a video for this. There's a great video done about how there are public policies that have over 90% approval that do not get passed because there's no one donating money to politicians to get them passed. And then there are things with absurdly low, like less than 20% approval ratings that do get passed into law because they have big lobbies around them with lots of people giving lots of money to politicians. There's an organization called the Sunlight Foundation, which follows money in politics and shows that in the US, the thing that gets laws passed is money, and donating money to politicians who will support their cause is what gets their cause, their laws passed. So we are in a very, you know, and more, it gets worse. So corruption itself, like legitimate bribery, is completely legal in the US. You are allowed to give unlimited amounts of money to politicians at all levels of government and judges in America. You don't believe me? Look up Citizens United and look up the following court cases. This is legitimately the law of the land right now. And I really encourage people to look up which justices supported Citizens United, which opposed it, and which parties they were with. Although I'm not going to get into like playing political games because I'm an independent, but this is a you know, a very party lines decision. And unfortunately, you know, I side with the person who's against legalized bribery. So that said, you know, right now that's my single issue vote, more or less. So because legalized bribery basically means that none of us, you know, none of us are probably making over $10 million a year, you know, so we don't have enough financial influence to really influence the politics of the country. And only, you know, less than 1% of 1% of the country really has that level of influence. And so if we want to give away all that influence to the top 1% of the top 1%, it's not even the top 1%, by the way, it's the top 1% of the top 1%, because out of the top 1% who get 80% of economic gains, 80% of the top 1%'s economic gains go to the top 1% of the top 1%. So actually the lion's share goes to a very small fraction of the country. And those are the people who have all the political influence of judges and politicians. And so that's something that's very concerning about democracy, in addition to the other things going on in our country. So that said, now I've finished an open debate discussion. Mike, you were, Ellis, did you have something you wanted to say?
Oh, yes, good. Anyways, what I did was I put in our chat our contact information.
Great.
And since we're almost wrapping up, anybody who wants to speak, put up your hands now. We'll get to all of you before 9. We do have a hard stop at 9. And if you like everything that you're seeing tonight, we have upcoming events. August 30th, What is Love? September 6th is Religion versus Spirituality. And September 13th, we have Guiding Each Other Towards Happiness. So I will put our website for Meetup in the chat, and you all are welcome to join.
Great. Mike, go ahead. Thank you for that.
I remember you used to have blogs on philosophy and consciousness. Is this document that you described in one of your blogs? And if so, can you put...
Everything I've written is in Google Docs, actually, and they're all in the online, not all, but the majority of them are in the online forum and Discord, in what's called the reference channel. There are different channels for conversation topics, and reference is like a place for people to post things that other people could read that are just like resources to look at. And so every time that a topic comes up that I've written about, I go, oh, you know, I'm going to post my essay on that in the reference channel, because I've written definitely over 50, probably over 100 essays on pretty much any philosophical topic that's interesting. So yeah, Mike, that is in there if you're interested. And if you don't find it, let me know and I'll post it.
Okay, the comment that I got two short comments, and I'll try and be a little shorter than I have been in the past. Our Will from Australia calls the Land of Oz. We should know that the Wizard of Oz program is not a fairy tale. It was written about what was happening to our economic system and the creation of the of our Federal Reserve System and our current set of econometrics. Behavioral economics is important, and it is very nonlinear. And some of the things we've been talking about are how to apportion the pie rather than to create win-win things and make the pie bigger and more fair. The Wizard of Oz basically said that you're never going to be fair. The best you can do is make people equally unhappy and kind of minimize unhappiness rather than maximize happiness. Kahneman in behavioral economics won a Nobel Prize for putting numbers to some of that. Not in his popular book, but in some of his papers. There's one more thing. Those equations are very similar to the equations that happened at the time of the Big Bang. And if at the time of the Big Bang, hydrogen had been equally distributed throughout the universe, nothing would have happened. Stars wouldn't have been created. They wouldn't have exploded and created calcium and iron and magnesium and all the things that make life. And we have the same problem going on in economics by trying to divide the pie. And that's why we're slowly descending into I know there are economists who know how to fix this, but the political solution is that you can sell is to create equality and equity and fairness. And that whether you believe in Leontief or St. Augustine, that ain't going to happen. So a lot more to say on that. I think I see your essay coming up in the chat that Alice put together. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Great comments. And yeah, I'm a big believer in win-win situations and making the pie bigger. But if we make the pie bigger, we also need to make sure that everybody gets a part of that bigger pie. What's going on right now and for the last 40 to 50 years is the pie's getting bigger, but the only people whose income is getting bigger are the top 1%. And out of them, 80% of it goes to the top 1% of them. So actually almost everybody else is more or less stagnant for the last 40 to 50 years. So part of what I want to do is like create a world where, yes, the pie gets bigger and yes, everybody makes more money along with the pie getting bigger so that people who are pianists can, the average pianist can make, in modern day US dollars, $100,000 a year. And right now they're not making anywhere near that, right? But in 50 to 100 years, that's very realistic, while still letting there be trillionaires and billionaires and all of the above, and millionaires still too. But it's just not possible now because the pie's not big enough. But the pie is getting bigger. We're innovating, we're getting more efficient. Lots of stuff is improving. There are also lots of risks to humanity going on. So I don't want to understate that. But I do think that making the pie bigger and making sure everybody gets a piece of that bigger pie is the key. Ellis, did you still have your hand up from before, or do you still have something else to say?
Oh, no, that's it.
Great.
Yeah, we'll just try to get through the rest of the comments. If anyone wants to say anything, that's a good time to put up your hand now. We're going to close at 9.
Yeah, April, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going back to work at a high school in New York City, and everything we're talking about now is making me think about how broken our system is, and it's so frustrating. I don't know if everyone's aware, but there's this new policy now where regardless of where you're zoned, it doesn't matter. There's basically a lottery system. So it used to, up until now, students based on their academic performance would have a better shot at getting the high school that they wanted to. And I know that there are certain groups of students, I think based on ethnicity or things like that, that might put them at a better shot of getting school if they want to. But basically, it's a lottery system. And I've talked to a lot. I don't have kids myself, but I've talked to a lot of the parents, and I hear so much frustration because there are students who really, really try, and if they're not seeing benefits from trying, they're losing, they're getting frustrated. And there's been less emphasis on gifted programs. And part of the reason is that, there hasn't been fairness in gifted programs around the entire city. There definitely has been discrimination, racism throughout, for years in different parts of the city. But does that mean you limit gifted and talented programs for everyone? So I feel sometimes that by trying to fix fairness and make things more fair, we sometimes create more problems and making things unfair for other people. I think it also comes down to whether or not some people believe in the idea of a meritocracy, because no one's starting at a completely level field, but there needs to be some kind of rewards for putting in efforts. I would think, I just feel for my students.
Yeah, I agree with you, April, and I think that's a great case of where people have a misunderstanding about the truth in order to try to be more fair. It's a case of where someone says, we're going to give everybody an equal chance at a great school, instead of giving those that have applied themselves, worked harder to get into a great school, a better chance at a good school. And, I think, I would love to sit down and have a bottle of wine with one of those people that thinks that everybody deserves an equal chance at being in a top performing school, because the truth is, I would argue it's really bad for some of them. You put students that are drastic underperformers in a top performing school, they're going to drown. They're going to be unsuccessful. They're not going to be able to, whereas like if you put them with a professor or a teacher that is really attuned to people who are struggling with school, I know teachers that do a great job with kids that are, not academically talented or come from difficult school households, and you put them with a teacher like that, they can thrive, right? Whereas you put them with a teacher who just delegates and gives work and expects the student to come back on their own and get it done, if they're going home and don't have the support to get that homework done, they're not going to be as successful. So it's a complicated issue, because I do think that everybody should get a good schooling, like everyone should get a good education. But New York City is such a big city, and you have schools like, Stuyvesant and other schools like that that are like, top notch for, a long time. I agree with you that what is the fair thing to do is not always reached by everybody with 100% consensus. I'm not arguing that it is, but I would argue that if we have the same base understanding and the same base facts that we can agree on, then we can come to a conclusion about what's fair in that scenario. And what I would argue is that ultimately it's about what increases happiness and decreases harm throughout people's lifetimes. And I would argue that, if someone has a counterexample to that, I challenge anyone to come up with a counterexample where, increasing happiness and decreasing harm, net is not a good thing to do. That said, I want to let Ocean go. You're on mute, Ocean.
Thank you.
There you go.
Well, so many important, intelligent ideas spilled out by so many other members. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for that, Garrett. Okay, well, I think first comes first. So increasing happiness. Well, it depends on how you define increasing happiness, decreasing harm. I disagree with the domestic violence or physical abuse. At the same time, if you look at the lives of Michael Jackson, his father is was a professional boxer, and he's a practically asshole, and he's like a very abusive father, very disciplined his child and my other Jackson brothers and sisters, and they all became top class entertainer. He was never like a sugar daddies, but he was a very abusive father, you know. And but I don't think Michael had a lot of happy time during the during the childhood, you know. But he became one of the top paid and the greatest dancers in the world throughout the globe, you know. So you know, while I against the direct physical abuse like raping and killing and stuff, you know, if you're just seeking happiness and decreasing some kind of pain or something, I don't know, that works with people who try to achieve the top of the top, you know, whether you want to become heavyweight champion of the world or become the greatest pianist in the world or something like that, because it's like hellish to it's almost like being in the prison cells, maximum prison cells, no freedom, just a lot of hellish. Other thing is I fortunately have a friend. His first name's Dave. I'm not gonna say his last name because last name is a very famous last name. If I mention, some people will smile. It's a very famous family, and his family is worth billions. And his family owns several skyscrapers in New York. And I think some people mentioned a few minutes ago that having the money after a certain point, it becomes a burden or nothing. I don't think so. I mean, he's one of the happiest, most stress-free human beings on the planet. And you know, and his family, it was one of the biggest financial donors of many politicians, including California Governor Jerry Brown when he became the California governor back in 1980s. You know, and his family has a lot of political influence over it. I don't know how much they pay less tax than you and I, or less, you know, but I agree. They have definitely 0.01% class and has a lot of political influence. And I don't think they
I'm not sure if anybody else is having trouble hearing.
He's breaking up again.
Yeah.
He's breaking up terribly. I'm getting
He needs
nothing.
a new microphone.
You know, they're happy with the way it is. And if you preach this kind of stuff to talk about it, yeah.
Yeah, Ocean, we lost you for a bit there, but I heard a lot of them
So
said.
and other people making other people miserable. I think
You need a new microphone. I might have mentioned it before.
It might be internet. It might be his internet, actually. I think
Thanks so much, Ocean. Garrett will
can
just
you hear me or
comment
no?
on that, and then we have a two more.
Ocean,
one of-
let's let Robert go.
Okay, sure.
If you don't
Go ahead.
mind, we're having trouble hearing you because of the internet, Ocean.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Robert.
Thanks. Yeah, I like the classrooms were brought up because yeah, I think there are definitely different kinds of learners, and if you try to teach everyone the same way, it ends up being unfair because some people will be left out. And it doesn't matter which learning style you cater to, there'll always be at least some people that end up being left out, right? So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting example. I did like the idea in your notes about stopping bribery. And yeah, I think that is sort of what I was trying to get at earlier about things like social justice and changing the system, right? Right now, there is a system of bribery in place, and that's sort of the way things work, right? And I believe a lot of people would say, well, that's the way it's been working, so we will continue that way, right? But is it working, right? For a lot of other people, it's definitely not working. So yeah, so I think changing the system, to me, has a greater impact than trying to work within an unfair system. Because you might get fair people, but you might get unfair people. But if you change the system, a fair system is harder to corrupt than a corrupt system is to make fair, if that makes sense. At least that's my point of view. My last comment would just be that if we do talk about other cultures, I would kind of lean more into the fairness and ethics are subjective, because I think what our fairness, what we consider fair, might not be what they consider fair, and vice versa, right? It just feels like we're kind of putting ourselves in a position to say that our fairness is right and their fairness is wrong, which to me is unfair because their culture is a certain way for their reasons, right? Unless we grew up in that culture, it's hard to really make that comparison. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so thanks, Robert. And I guess you're honing in on some very interesting nuanced arguments that people use to defend legalized bribery. Some people say, oh, it's always been like that. Money always bought political influence, but the truth is, no, it hasn't. Like you couldn't donate, more than, I forget what it was, like $4,000 or $2,400 to a political candidate before 2010. And then since 2010, you can give $1 billion to a political candidate. They can become a judge over a trial that you're currently, being tried for by that judge, and you can get that judge a job at the next highest level circuit, right? Like because you gave him $1 billion to campaign on, and bribe politicians with. All right, well, that definitely doesn't feel fair to me, and I don't think it would feel fair to you, Robert. Even if some countries might argue that that is fair, and right now some people in the US do argue that that's fair, I would argue that no, it's not fair. I do think ultimately, Robert, as far as subjectivity, everybody's got to come to their own conclusions. And in a country where there's a democracy and you can vote for politicians, you can vote for the people, you still have the freedom to vote for the people that make those decisions. In countries like Afghanistan, where you don't vote for the politicians and you don't vote for the people in power, the people with the guns are the ones that are in power. And even if that is the rule of might makes right in that land, I wouldn't argue that everybody in Afghanistan thinks that women shouldn't be educated, even though now if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you can't really be educated, or you risk death. And so I think that most of the women and probably most of the men know that that's not fair, but the people who have the majority of the guns are enforcing that rule. And so unfair things are happening in that society, not because subjectively the majority agrees those things are fair, but because the people with the guns and might makes right are making those things a reality. And for better or worse, we're no longer in a position to be able to influence those things. And I don't think we ever really were for very long in a sustainable way anyway. And that's a whole nother story for another night. But that said, I guess you're very, I don't know if you're more in tune with US politics or you just happened onto that argument, but it was very insightful, Robert. Thanks for your comments. And Will, I want to let you go.
Thank you, Garrett. I was just thinking about when you were talking about the education system and how the unfairness and how it would be better for children with learning difficulties to be treated differently. And it just reminded me of, I saw Sam Harris recently talking about, they were saying, when did you become so sort of prone to getting into debate and arguments? And he said, you know what, I don't know when it happened. He said, it was more or less my factory settings. He said, I came out that way. And I thought, what a great expression, my factory settings. And then I was having a discussion with someone about how when we were all little babies in the crib, in the maternity ward, my opinion is we all just shared consciousness. Our view of the world hadn't been formed until we get out of the maternity ward into the home and things start happening to us. And then we form a view of the world, which is stored in our neurological pathways in our prefrontal cortex. And these guys said, no, you've got innate traits that all the little babies in the maternity ward, in the cribs, I might have said cribs, I meant cribs in the maternity ward, they've got predispositions and innate traits. And then I saw Sam Harris say that was my factory settings. And I thought, we've all got factory settings. We all come out with innate aptitudes. And if we could, and then that resonated with what you said, that if we could just sort of recognize our innate traits and filter them appropriately. However, in a capitalist model, especially men, but it applies to women as well, are valued by how much money they can make. And that's not even reflective of how much they put back into the community in way of taxes, like some sort of greater good, because the biggest money earners often pay the best accountants so as they can pay the less tax. So when it's all about money, I think our individual talents actually get overlooked for the sake of the dollar. So anyway, that's a bit of a, maybe a bit off topic, but it could make a good topic perhaps. But you've got to be careful how far you go with, oh no, you're just a bricklayer. You could never be a doctor because you're only got the app, you know, you've got to be careful with locking people in as well, you know.
Yeah, I will give a counter argument to what I said, in that there also have been studies that show that students from poorer neighborhoods, when they are challenged by their teacher to like rise to the occasion and study really hard and work really hard, and they're given high expectations to live up to, and a teacher who believes in them to study hard, they do really well. Like they do amazingly well. There's a teacher at my wife's high school that, you know, there's a movie made after that, took a, you know, an inner city, like very poor school and taught a music class that just inspired students and like made them go off the charts in terms of academic capabilities. And so it's very possible to hone in on people's natural talents. By the way, the reason Sam Harris says factory settings is he's a determinist and he thinks that we're all pre-programmed ever since the Big Bang to do whatever we're going to do. Every decision we made is pre-programmed from the Big Bang. So he has a very silly argument for that, which is basically an assumption of determinism in order to prove determinism. So it's a circular argument, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't know if he was arguing it's deterministic, but
I read his paper. He argues determinism.
Oh, I know he does, but whether he's prosecuting that as his reason for having innate traits is another matter, I guess. But perhaps that's where he gets from. Who knows?
It's his paradigm.
But we do have innate talents, don't we?
You know, ironically, Will, I'm going to agree with him that we have innate traits. I just think those innate traits come along with our spirit, and that it comes from, you know, prior, you know, whatever happened before we were born, wherever the spirit was and whatever it learned. I think we do have innate traits. So I don't disagree with him about the factory settings. I'm just pointing out that we agree on it for different reasons. That said, I want to let Shaunak go, and I apologize, Shaunak, I didn't jump you to the front of the line. I should have. I didn't notice you had your hand up, and you hadn't spoken yet.
No issues, Gareth. Just coming to problems that we had, I completely agree with that, you know, eliminating the driving issue. But what my question is what could be the solution to that? And the question is more like, you know, these similar situations come up. What could be a class of solutions for that? What I'm referring to is, so, okay, we want to stop the bribery that's happening in the government, but the people who will pass the law that will stop the bribery are the people who are making the decisions in the first place, right? The politicians are the ones who are going to be working towards changing that law. The thing is, everybody, I believe, is, you know, they're driven by incentives over here, and none of these politicians will be given the incentive to change that law. So the question arises, it's like, by the nature of it, it seems like it's going to just stay unless and until there is an insurgency in the whole, you know, populace. It's just like there's a civil war or something like that. I'm exaggerating it a lot, but you know, similar kind of situations, laws that we want to change. How do you suggest, or how does anyone else suggest you bring about that change? Because they are the ones who are going to make the change, and they are not interested in making the change.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, we're gonna have to wind down here. I just realized it's after 9 o'clock. But to answer your question, it was the last thing that I presented, which is electing incorruptible politicians, electing politicians who are altruists, who don't do just what's in their best interest, electing politicians who understand what fairness is and will do what's fair rather than what's going to help themselves. The problem is the people that get into positions of power are the ones that want to feed their own egos. And unfortunately, our system is set up to make those people successful. The people who seek power are the ones who want to control. What we need to put in place are politicians, and we need to elect politicians that want to empower rather than to overpower. Our current politicians want to control. And honestly, if I psychoanalyze them, they want to control because they don't have enough control over themselves and their own lives. And so therefore they want to control other people. and they want to, be influencing other people. And that said, it's a very fixable problem right now because we still have a democracy. We almost didn't, I think, but that's another topic for another night. But that said, it's a very fixable problem right now, but it may not always be fixable. And it's only fixable if we, actually learn to elect politicians who are altruists and want to do the right thing rather than help themselves.
I agree to that solution, but the point is it also happens that I'm not saying politics is an easy environment. Many a times I've heard politicians, it's just like once they enter the realm of politicians, there are extraneous factors that make it extremely difficult to not, fight against it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it becomes extremely difficult. And to keep themselves in power, they have to continue to depend on these donations in a way. So
no,
that's what I've heard.
There are politicians that don't. In fact, I believe Bernie Sanders out fundraised without taking any money from super PACs, which is how politicians achieve legalized bribery. Bernie Sanders took no money from super PACs, but through large numbers of small donations, out fundraised most of his competitors, if not all of them. So
but that's just one vote.
They don't need to. The point is that most people are doing it because it's easier, and it is easier to give into corruption. It's easier to do lots of things. What we need to do is elect people who don't want to do what's easier. They want to do what's the right thing to do. And Shaunak, I like you a lot, but you're sounding very defeatist, like there's no way to fix this. There is a way to fix it, but the only way to fix it is have the same resolve and to elect people with the same resolve that we have, that we want to see in our politicians. We have to have that resolve ourselves, and we have to elect people who have that resolve. And that said, I want to let David say one last
Garrett,
comment.
maybe let David go, and then you'll wrap up.
And then we'll wrap up. Yeah, go ahead, David.
The only thing I wanted to say is I agree with you that we do have factory settings, but in the case of fairness or ethics in general, I think the factory settings can be reset by the environment that you grow up in, so that given the universe perhaps not being all that fair, we grow up in it. We're initially set with a reasonable fairness as our shall we say, primary setting when we're born. Like, we do have some innate traits or factory settings for sure. We're not a blank slate. But even so, given the environment we grow up in and the fact that the universe seems to be not very fair in general, I would say, people for no reason or other have hard lives. Others, through no fault of their own, have hard lives. Other people have easy lives through no credit to themselves. So I don't think we can just fall back on innate settings and say everyone's got a good sense of fairness. I just think that's unrealistic. Anyway, that's my summary. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can I say a few words before you go?
Ocean, let me respond to David, and then we'll give you one quick second. But I do think, David, I do agree that our fairness, I think we have an inherent sense of fairness, but it gets corrupted, quite frankly, by our environment, because most people are not brought up in a family where truth is what we're striving for. Most people are not brought up in an environment where what they seek is truth. They learn all kinds of bad habits and all kinds of misunderstandings about the world, and then they use those misunderstandings to decide what's fair. Unfortunately, they're basically trying to build a castle on on a bed of sand, and that's not really a good recipe for success. So I agree with you, David, but I would argue that the solution to that is to teach people to build the castle on a solid foundation, to help people come in more close contact with truth, to seek truth, to listen with an open-minded truth, to share their ideas transparently, so the things they believe that are not true get shown to them as not true, because they listen to those other ideas with an open mind that are better than their own. And in doing that as a community, as the Freethinker Institute community, we can help each other find truth more clearly and see the truth more clearly, so that we can be more fair amongst those people we influence. And so that's the idea of like what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. You're one of the factors in the environment that's pushing people more towards fairness, and
Exactly.
hopefully hopefully the factors that are working against you or that idea are weaker, so that in the long run fairness will out.
Yep, I
Hopefully.
agree with you. Ocean, do you want to add a final
Yeah,
comment?
yeah. I want you to think what okay. I give you the actual example. I'm a professional musician, and I had honor to serve for many celebrities like a Clint Eastwood, Mel Gibson, and even Deepak Chopra. I had honor to play for thousands of people. Anyways, and I usually charge $300 an hour, and that's 2 hour minimum plus the traveling fee. And what do you think that's fair? For example, famous tenor singer Pavarotti used to charge $10,000 an hour. And I don't think his music is so much superior than me. He can get away with charging $10,000 because he has a reputation and fame. And whereas I don't have any fame like him. At the same time, I have friends, local friends who are happy to play for $50 an hour or $100 an hour. And they think I'm unfair, that I'm charging too much. I can get away with $300 an hour. And I feel people like a Pavarotti is unfair because he's using his own fame to charge much more money. So and what do you think? Do you think I'm fair, or do you think I'm fair in charging $300 an hour, or no?
So I would argue that people are fair to charge, what they can, and that the people who are buying the products and services should decide, what they're willing to pay based on the value that they get from the person playing. And ultimately, I am a fan of free markets and free market capitalism, where as long as both people agree to transaction, like it seems pretty fair to me. Like I think there should be taxes, don't get me wrong, but like ultimately between goods and services, I think, I like the Warren Buffett quote, price is what you pay and value is what you receive, and they aren't always equal. And so as long as you feel you're getting more value than you're paying in price, you're going to make that transaction. Now, if you build your reputation up so that it's bigger than Pavarotti's, you'll be able to charge more than 10,000, but maybe you won't because you're a benevolent guy and like you'll charge less because you don't feel like you want to charge that much. And cool, that's like it's a personal preference. And at that point, I consider it a personal choice. What I want to see come about is your friends making, charging $50 an hour that are probably only getting 20 hours of work a week at most. They're probably not making, $100,000 a year. I want to see every musician making $100,000 a year, in modern USD dollars, so that money doesn't buy happiness anymore. That's really the goal for me, is so that everybody makes enough money that money doesn't buy happiness. At that point, no one's going to care who charges how much, because more money isn't going to make anyone happier. And if we get to that point as a world, like we've gotten to a very good place, and I don't hear anyone else but me advocating for this. People are trying to end poverty. That's great. I think we should do that. But I want to go a step further, which is to make it so that money is not a factor to people's happiness. And so that's the difference between what we're striving for versus what is commonly being sought. Does that make sense, Ocean?
Well, that makes sense, but I don't know. You're following the very powerful organization called World Economic Forum, Mr. Klaus Schwab, student of Henry Kissinger, and they predicted that within 10 years, the AI, the computer, will take over 90% of even essential jobs like accounting or those, the essential jobs. Practically 95% of us will be on the welfare, living under the universal basic income, live in a small place with a $700 a month and live very poorly for the rest of our lives. That's what they're predicting. I hope that's not going to be actualized, but they are very powerful. There is a lot of smart people are saying that. So yeah, at that point, money doesn't mean anything because we are all living and eating with the cat food all the time. So I don't know. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that they were predicting that in 1900 when the Industrial Revolution was going on, and they said factories are going to automate all of us out of a job, and no one's going to have a job 20 years from now in 1920, and it hasn't happened yet. And what I will tell you, Ocean, is I have a very dim or dark view of artificial intelligence in terms of general of artificial intelligence. And I'm in the, I guess I don't want to say it, but I guess I'm of the opinion, and I have an essay for this that I'll post in the reference channel of the online community, but I do not think it's wise to build general artificial intelligence, and I'll leave it to the paper, the essay, to explain why that is. But I think it would very much not be in our best interest. And if we got to the point where 90% of jobs were automated, there would be general AI. And I'll tell you, none of those guys are going to be any more important than an amoeba is today. They're going to be cockroaches compared to general artificial intelligence, quite frankly, and they will all be living miserable lives. So if they're right, they're going to be helpless little scrubs on the face of the earth.
I want to correct your perception. I want to correct your perception. I actually, to be honest with you, I'm like a Jacqueline. I was like a Jacqueline Onassis, the wife of JFK. Before they got married, the JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy, asked Jacqueline Kennedy, while they were engaged. So if I give you, he's one of the richest people in America, Kennedy family, founder of the Kennedy dynasty. And if I know you are going to marry my son, but if I'm going to give you $1 million back then it's like $100 million in today's money, right? So if I give you $1 million right now, what's your answer? And I think most benevolent, modest girl would be, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you very much. But the Jacqueline Kennedy I would say, okay, I'll take your $1 million, but where's another $1 million? I want $2 million. And Joseph Kennedy said, oh, what a greedy bitch you are. He said, you are type of the girl who should be the wife of my son, and chose her. So, and that's the same token. I want to correct your perception of Ocean with your benevolent soul. So even if I become as famous as a Pavarotti, I'm gonna keep my modest price. No. If
I'm not saying you would. I don't know.
Pavarotti, I'm going to charge $1 million an hour if I can get away with it. So
there you go.
Thank you very much.
So with that said, I appreciate your comments, and I know there's a hand up, but I really have to go, guys. Like, I was up at 4 o'clock this morning, so I need to get some rest, and I'm not going to be able to sleep for at least another 45 minutes because I love these events and my adrenaline's through the roof right now. So that said, I want to thank everybody for coming. I appreciate everybody's comments. And I hope that you all will come to the online community to chat throughout the week. And I hope you'll come back next Tuesday. What's our event next Tuesday, Ellis?
Next Tuesday is What is Love? It's going to be great.
A more low-key, harmonious, hopefully, topic, although we probably will debate about that too, because as Will said, we all like to debate. That's part of the nature of the community. So would love to talk about love with all of you next Tuesday. And thank you all for your attention and time and your questions, your thoughtful comments. And I hope everybody has a lovely evening and rest well. Thanks so much, and I'll hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Gary.
Thanks.